Okay. I'm gonna try and make this short and sweet. Namely because I don't really want to be doing this. So, so obviously there's these allegations against Mike Bickle. And actually, what I don't want to talk about is those particular allegations. I think it's a good opportunity to talk about wider things, particularly prophetically. So this is a bit of a prophetic word about more allegations to come. I think this is the tip of the iceberg, unfortunately. I'm going to explain all that. And I guess teach, in a way, what I think is how we handle these allegations. And three, prophetically, just why now? I think this is all important. I think there are two lessons to learn. And just one is the response I've seen so far. So, okay, where do I start? So I guess I should give you my bit of my history on this. Somewhere in IHOP t-shirts. I don't know the language. I guess some people would think, though I don't think it's true. I'm a fan of IHOP, and therefore a fan of Mike Bickle. I wouldn't say that label language is particularly correct. In some ways, yeah, I guess you could say that. I think there's better language. Hero, again, certainly more so, yeah. The guys that do IHOP would be heroes to me. Some ways I would certainly look up to them. That might be a better. So that's my context. So my context of that context is like God started speaking to me about certain things, politics, what was going on in the world. We had the big crash in 2008, I think, post that. So the crash was 2007. Had me go through the book of Daniel, and I realized prayer was the key to changing the earth, basically. Don't pray, nothing happens. So I started to get involved in prayer. Some guys who I was fairly friendly with at that time, ironically, have become less friendly with down the years. And actually now are in Kansas, though weirdly not at IHOP. Anyway, it was announced in church that I was going to that they were going to IHOP to blah blah blah, and they were coming back to start a house of prayer. So I've been involved in houses of prayer in the last 15 years. I've been to IHOP twice. I've been to the prayer room. It's a amazing place. Even if you go there today, it will be an amazing place. It's difficult to describe. It's like nothing else you will see anywhere on the planet at all. Simply because you've got these people who've been praying for 20 plus years continuously, and there's an atmosphere when you go there. It's not just unique; it's special, which makes everything going on very difficult in a way. Is it difficult for me? Yeah. I mean, all these things are difficult. Am I shocked? No. So anyway, that's my background. Okay, what should I deal with next? So kind of, if you know anything of my prophetic history so far, so God spoke to me about the coming election in the UK in 2010, and it was to do with the church's ineffectiveness in this nation. I think there's the same word in the wider nations. the church really had no authority because it left its seat of authority. And the word that God gave me is like the coming election, chaos. It's happening basically because the church has left its seat of authority and it needs to return. And then God said to me when I saw him pretty quickly, he said to me, like, this is a period of grace to return. And then I saw him more and he said to me, so this is a kind of threefold thing. So first the word, the grace, and then the judgment. If the church didn't, that things which now in this decade would kick off big time. And when I mean big time, I literally do mean we're scratching ahead so far in this decade of all the things that are going to go wrong unless we actually return. And I think this is an example of this. And actually, God specifically told me this sort of thing would happen like this. So that's why I'm not surprised. And I guess there's a word in there about the parallel. What's the word? Paralysis of the church. I think for me, there are a lot of reasons why the church is ineffective. And it's basically because it's lost the heart of the gospel. It's lost the heart of Jesus, really, is what I'm talking about. And that whole relationship. I mean, God has spoken. So that IHOP's message is a bridegroom message, and God has spoken to me before about that in part. And then you discover IHOP and you go, yeah, bingo. That's what is missing. So the allegations again are hard to deal with because of that. And I could just rattle on about that, but I won't. I think everyone can just give their opinion on that, and it's like not really helping a lot of people because like there are a lot of people who are in pain and suffering. And how do we deal with each one of our own pains and suffering? But my point would be, personally, I'm not shocked because God told me this would happen. When he told me, was I thinking Mike Bickle? Was I thinking IHOP? No, but from what he said to me, I was aware kind of who he was talking about. I would have thought he was talking about IHOP and Mike Bickle. But then again, it's not necessarily so that he's talking about Mike Bickle. But the whole thing is not a surprise, totally not. So kind of getting back to this decade. So what God said to me is, in the last decade we had grace. I just keep repeating this word. It's getting ridiculous because it's so old in my mind. And that was the last decade. And it was the time to return. If we didn't return, this is what God literally word for word said to me. There would have to be judgment to bring about his purposes in the earth. Because, you know, as I've noticed in the last 20 years, things just progressively get worse and worse in the earth. And there's this idea of the perfect storm, which is something prophesied by John Paul Jackson, who wasn't at IHOP or connected to Mike Bickle's church at the time, but was a Kansas City prophet, so to speak, whatever that means. So it's kind of this idea that there are four winds, the four winds of Revelation, and they are warfare. What's the second one? Religion, politics, and economics, and they're the four winds that basically wind the earth, so to speak, and they affect everything that goes on in the earth, particularly culturally and the whole value system. And obviously we see that today. And we see that getting progressively worse. And what God told me was like, this would need to happen. These things would need to happen. God is not necessarily doing them, but he is allowing them and he's pushing them, and he's basically using Satan. So Satan's got his own agenda. He's got his own purposes particularly in the earth, and God is using that as a tool to sanctify the earth. So that's what's going on. God also said to me it would start first with the church. I don't know. I had to kind of picture a lot of things. So what I pictured is basically what we've seen. I mean, none of this is really a surprise to me. So to me, what we see, all these issues. So we've had COVID, we've had economic problems, we've had the whole green thing, which has just got mental, which, by the way, has caused inflation, if you don't realise it. All these eco warriors going around the earth telling people they have to do this and have to do that, and being quite violent and aggressive about it. And that change has affected politics, which has led to inflation, basically. You know, when you have a different energy strategy, and it's a bad one and things go bad, you get inflation. And this is only going to get worse. When you have a war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine, then the last week or so we've got a war in Israel, which is serious biblically, between Israel, and now you've got these allegations. To probably the person who is equally the most detested and the most acknowledged in the body of Christ. So anyway, the way I saw it was like, the way I pictured it was like there would be a kind of, not a grace period, but just a period of time where the church has just experienced things that the world's experiencing, which are pretty terrible. And again, perfect storm, these are all coming together to create the perfect storm. But then God would have to judge his church first, because how can God begin to judge the world before he judges his people? So anyone who's any position of authority in terms of judgment has to judge their own first before they can pick on people outside. That's a bad term, but like effectively, yeah. Like, you judge your own children before you criticize other people's children, because that's the parental role. And again, let's not forget, this isn't just about judgment, it's about God's purposes in the earth through the church. And the whole point of the church is, the only way his purposes come in his kingdom is through his kingdom people, whoever you classify that. Obviously, the church would then have a massive say in that. Israel does have a part to play, and we're seeing stuff in Israel happen and emerging, because it says it in the Bible why, that they have a part to play. But anyway, we're still not returned. So this isn't a surprise to me. One of the key things God said to me. So there are several key things God actually said to me, word for word. So one is kind of, when this stuff happened, it would feel like the second coming was coming pretty quickly, and it's not. That was one thing. That's kind of probably to me the most shocking. And the next most shocking is, I mean, Mike Bickle's actually talked about this, ironically, that, and this is what people don't like a new kind of Christianity and kind of tipping it upside down. A redefinition. And I can see why people don't like those terms, but God had been saying the same thing to me for over 2 decades, because the church isn't really representing Jesus and isn't like Jesus and isn't really connected to the heart of Jesus. It's not really Jesus's church, it's our church, and that's the thing that needs corrected. We need to get back to what we're called to be and who we're called to be, effectively. And yeah, I guess you could argue about that, but like, for me it's simple, because you see when the church is effective, and why, because it understands its purpose, particularly in its own generation, and it understands the heart of God, particularly in that generation. And I think actually, of any generation of church, we've kind of totally lost that since Dark Ages and the Catholic Church. That's a whole long story. So judgment's got to come to the church first. And it kind of, let's not go through what judgment is and just throw it up in the air because it's a long subject. I can understand people don't like that word, but effectively that's what's happening, however we want to see it. And again, God necessarily isn't pushing judgment. These aren't coming straight from the throne, but God's allowing these things in the earth to happen because they're basically sanctify and refine us. And I guess the overarching idea is things will keep going wrong until something happens. Somebody stands up and says, right, okay, this is a problem, need to sort it out. So in the political areas, in the religious areas, in the economic areas, but no one can really. I mean, it's the whole point. It's the whole point of this new generation. Is like they want to fix everything without the realization that actually the only person that can fix it is Jesus Christ, or Yeshua HaMashiach, if you give him his proper term and proper names in Hebrew, in Jewish, because Jesus is Hebrew, he is Jewish. He's a Jewish king. Really, if we dig down on the Bible, which is another issue which we won't talk about, all these things become obvious because they're all in the Bible. So particularly, what God said to me and word for word is that these big mega denominations and streams and ministries, as well as others, would just like disappear overnight. And within that, because not just for, but one of the reasons would be leaders caught in serious sin and particularly sexual sin. And sexual sin is important, which we won't discuss. So why is it always sexual sin? It's a good question. That's always been a big problem. But basically, the whole church needs redefining, and God would just allow the whole kingdom of Christianity, so to speak, to be turned upside down so that it could be part of the kingdom of God, so that Jesus gets his church back. That's the key underwriting theme. So is IHOP in that, does God want to then topple IHOP? I would say no, but who am I to know? Are these allegations true? Who am I to know? So I really don't want to talk about those allegations, but that from my perspective is kind of why it's important for me to make this video and talk about it, because that's the word that God's given me to give to you. Basically, overall, I don't really have anything else to give, and if I have anything else to give, it's on the same topic. That's the topic of any topic for me. That's kind of my prophetic ministry, so to speak, if you want to call it that. Don't call it that, by the way. So yeah, that's kind of the background. So I think it's important. So for me, what I'm seeing, because again, this is kind of what God showed me, is like all this stuff is a paralysis in the earth and in the church. So how to not be paralyzed by it is for you to actually understand basically God in the word and what God's doing in the earth in this generation through understanding the word. And like I said before, if you read the word, so there's lots of paralysis going on. So there's poverty paralysis because the economic situation. There's paralysis to do with warfare. There's paralysis to do with media in the warfare. There's a paralysis to do the role of politics, and there are all sorts of things that are happening in the earth. So this is another subject. but they all get confusing, and when you have lots of confusing things confusing you, you get very confused, and that's what's causing this paralysis, because it's like, well, what's going on? When you're paralyzed, you're inactive. You can't move. If you ever played like this wouldn't be the point, by the way, but it is a good example of the point. If you ever played like role-playing games on computer games, and you can like do things to fight in these computer games, one of the things you can do is paralyze people, and they basically can't move, and that's the point of paralysis. Like, you're so paralyzed by confusion that you can't move in the context of what we're talking about. This is deliberate. This is the method for the perfect storm. And again, we've got that as a win, kind of, and the opposite win that's coming down from heaven is forcing us to into the reality of we need more of God. So that's the overarching thing. So that's basically my message I bring, that this is all part of this. So part of that message is, I have to reiterate this. What I saw and what God literally told me is it would just get worse and worse and worse and worse until the church, something happened in the church turned. We're waiting for God to move, but actually God's waiting for us to move our hearts back towards him and say, like, basically, we have sinned. The prodigal son, basically, when he returns, that would be it. I've done this, I've sinned, I've turned my heart away from you, I've run away from you, and now I'm coming back. So all this, again, is to drive us back to God. So if you are totally confused by these allegations, and you feel paralyzed, and anything in the world you feel confused and paralyzed by, just get back to God. That's the point. So what I was saying before, I can't reiterate that enough, so I'm going to just keep reiterating it. We need to get back to God. So what God showed me is, again, the things we see happening are just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, and it's going to be more sorts of things, and it's going to be a transition from everyone in the world to being affected to not necessarily the church being the only thing that will be affected, because that's not going to happen, but there's a kind of, in terms of the things we see happening and manifesting in earth that are causing this paralysis and confusion, there are two types. There's one for the world, so everyone in the world, and there's one for the church. The one from the church has now been launched, I believe. And it's no surprise to me we've got this war between Hamas and Israel. You know, that in the context of why I say, if you think about it rationally, it's not paralysis. It's like, well, naturally you would expect that to happen. So it's the unparalysis by understanding the paralysis, so to speak. So I believe that's beginning to happen. Now, this is how I would put it. Like, it's not only is going to get worse, it's just the beginning of the beginning. So if you look at time, you've got an end, a beginning, and a middle. And people sometimes talk about the end of the beginning. We haven't even hit the end of the beginning. For what's happening in church, we've hit the beginning of the beginning, and it's only going to get worse. So other things are going to manifest themselves. I believe, from what God's told me, he will topple senior leaders and leaders who are more senior than Mike Bickle, who are more popular, basically. And God wants to topple popularism in the church, and popular ideas in the church, because I think basically most of them are pretty much heretical, in my mind. And we're going to see lots of this. We're going to see ministries just upturned and just ending overnight. And literally yes, but literally no. But when these things happen, like it's happening with IHOP at the moment, and IHOP is just an example of what will happen. It's not a judgment. So I actually take that word now. This has actually happened very, very seriously, more seriously than I did before. And I probably, I don't know, maybe, I think it's reasonable to say to me, whether it's true or not, that I probably, in terms of serious, say that more serious than anyone else in the entire Earth universe. Certainly on the Earth. I don't mean the universe, I mean human beings. God obviously takes it far more serious. And now I'm taking it more serious. It's just interesting in that context to me. It started with IHOP and started with Mike Bickle, whatever happens. So, yeah, I mean, I've talked for 25 minutes and I barely talked about the allegations. So I've done that deliberately. So this is how serious this is. In any context, I think I said before, I'm not dealing with the allegations. It's irrelevant because it is irrelevant. But I kind of need to deal with something, which I'll do in a sec. I don't think there's anything else I need to say on that